Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Grace Holland. America's first bird flu death was reported earlier this week. The virus is still considered low risk, but this marks a milestone, showing the virus has mutated, and it raises some concerns about how widespread it could become. WRAL health reporter Grace Hayba spoke to a bird flu expert with decades of experience studying the virus. Grace, thanks for being here.
Of course, happy to be here.
So who is this expert that you talked to?
So I spoke with Richard Webby. He is a scientist who's based at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital out of Memphis, Tennessee. But the reason I really wanted to speak with him about bird flu is he spent over 2 decades tracing bird flu outbreaks from across the globe and really trying to understand what is this virus doing. And obviously now, in light of the recent cases we've seen, and especially after the death reported this week from Louisiana, his research is really coming into play now more than ever. So I wanted to talk to him about what he's doing. And he actually works with the World Health Organization's Collaborating Center for the Studies on the Ecology of Influenza in Animals and Birds. So it's a very convoluted title, but it's pretty fascinating because it's all part of the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System, which includes about 7 labs throughout the world. There's only one other one besides his here in the States, which is in Atlanta. But there's also labs in the UK, Japan, China, Russia, Australia, who are all kind of collaborating and monitoring what's going on in animals and birds and really trying to track what's happening with this virus so that if it does end up mutating even more, we at least could try to be a little ahead of the game.
And what does he say about how bird flu has changed since he started studying it?
So there's been quite a few changes. I mean, he said that the biggest thing is just really watching how it is spread. It started in Southeast Asia, and then over time it spread into Europe, into Africa, and eventually now, as we know, obviously into North and South America as well. And so that alone is interesting, but we've seen that happen too with pretty much every other illness there is as well, right? So it's not just bird flu, isolated to bird flu by any means. But that was one of the biggest things that stood out to him about the virus and just the way that it's moved kind of around the globe over the past 2 decades and some change. And so he said during that time, we've obviously learned a lot about it and like how it can cause disease, but there's still so much about it that we don't know. And one interesting thing that he brought up was about this time last year, we didn't even know that it would affect cows. And now obviously we've had several, national alerts and things like that. And CDC is monitoring outbreaks in different cattle herds and things like that. So again, even just within the past 12 months, we've seen this virus do something else. And even within the past month and some change, we've seen it affect someone and unfortunately kill someone right here in the States.
And what do we know about that bird flu death?
So what we know is that the person was older than 65, and they were in Louisiana. They've been hospitalized and found to have severe bird flu, and it was determined that they got it from birds that were in their backyard, so wild birds that were in their backyard. And the silver lining to all of this that Webby mentioned was that in this case and in another case that we saw in Canada recently where the virus mutated inside of that patient, it did not continue to transmit to another human. So we haven't gotten to the point where the bird flu is A, mutating, and B, mutating to the point where you or I could get it from someone who is sick. So that is kind of what's keeping us safe right now. But the fact that it mutated at all and wasn't just someone got sick, for example, when we had the worker in Colorado get sick, we didn't see this happen then. They just got sick and, recovered. But now that we're seeing it infect someone, mutate inside the body, that is cause for concern.
Okay. And with that being said, what is the risk of catching bird flu now and the concern going forward?
The risk for the average person is still very, very low. Again, it hasn't changed to the point where the average person just being around somebody who's sick could get it that we know of, right? So that is why we don't have these vaccines that are being developed, like rolled out in mass production yet. We haven't gotten there yet. So that at least, hopefully will be of some reassurance to everyone. But at the same time, you do want to avoid your contact with wild birds and wild animals, as you always should be, just not only because of bird flu, but they carry a number of other diseases and illnesses that could be harmful to you. But the average person who doesn't have a lot of contact with wild birds or birds in general, you aren't going to really be at risk for this right now. So that's really where we are, is just monitoring what has happened in Louisiana. Again, raising a lot of alarm bells, but we don't necessarily need to go into panic yet. And so that's kind of where these scientists are, is just continuing to monitor it to make sure that if we do start to see this mutate, that everything can kind of come into play. And that's where those vaccines would ultimately be very helpful.
Okay, let's take a quick break right there, and we'll be right back. Grace, before the break, you were saying that right now the risk is pretty low, which is reassuring. But again, this has set off some alarm bells for experts like the one you talked to. What is the chance that we could see a bird flu pandemic if that mutation happens to where it can be spread person to person?
I mean, it's definitely not zero, right? And it definitely has the potential to be very impactful. We all saw what happened with COVID, and the difference, though, with COVID and avian influenza, there's a lot of similarities in that they both started in animal hosts and then eventually, mutated and affected humans, and birds specifically. You have a bat and then you have birds. But at the same time, there are some key differences in the viruses. And the biggest is that we did not know how to make a vaccine against COVID. We all saw it was all hands on deck around the globe. It took quite a while, right, in the grand scheme of things, for something to happen. When you think about the fact that our yearly flu vaccines are manufactured every year, and that still takes several months for them to happen, think about that when there's not a precedent for it. So that's what the whole world had to deal with back in 2020, and ultimately when those vaccines started rolling out a while after that. But with avian influenza, we already do have a very good understanding of H5N1. Again, Webby has been researching this for over 20 years. I believe it's around 25 now. And so when you think about influenza, it's also easier, I've learned through talking to scientists like him and other researchers, to modify an influenza vaccine. That's why we're able to do it every year when we have strain A, strain B, strain C. And that's why, scientists predict that months in advance, and they modify these vaccines. So it's a little bit easier to tweak, so to speak, in layman's terms, compared to creating a whole new COVID vaccine, right? And then adjusting that as we've done since the first doses came out. And so a lot of effort has gone into making these H5 mRNA vaccines, and including, like, right here in the triangle, CSL Seqirus in Holly Springs has been tasked with manufacturing millions of doses of this vaccine. So if, again, we see that it mutates, and if the government tells a company like CSL Seqirus to, hey, roll these out, that's what we would then see happen. But we're not at that point. So the good news is we are far more prepared to fight something like an influenza outbreak. And the other thing, too, that I want to mention that Webby told me that I hadn't really thought of is when we implemented masking protocols, social distancing, all of that with COVID, obviously the main goal was to reduce the spread of COVID, right? But what we saw come out of that was actually more beneficial in slowing the spread of influenza. So we know that we do have good measures that we can roll back out if we need to, that would actually specifically be targeting influenza now. So things like that, I think, are a little bit reassuring, but again, still cause for concern. Something could happen. We never know. And the fact that this is happening at all, it is just concerning. That's really the best way to put it, is it is concerning.
Yeah, and so moving forward, what can people do to limit their risk of exposure? You mentioned, obviously, not getting close to wild birds.
Yeah, absolutely. If you see something out in the wild, especially any time that maybe an animal's acting weird or something like that, as with anything, leave it alone. Let it be. If you do see, maybe you're in your neighborhood and you see a bird that is acting suspicious, it's in an area where other people could be around it, go ahead and call your local animal control. Those are the experts. They know how to deal with things like that. Don't try to trap it yourself and touch it and do things like that. You don't want to risk exposing yourself. Again, even if it's not bird flu, it could be something else. You don't want to do that. Another good piece of advice from the CDC is just to thoroughly wash your poultry products, things like that, because we have seen bird flu go through poultry farms, and we even just got a new alert here in North Carolina about another outbreak on a poultry farm here. So just thoroughly washing, thoroughly cooking your produce like you always should be, washing your hands after you do so. If you have a weird smell or it's like a weird texture to it, don't eat it. It's better to be safe than sorry. And as with always, you should really avoid drinking raw milk. Another bright thing for those of us here in North Carolina is that the sale of raw milk is actually illegal. So if you're walking around the grocery store, you're listening to this, and you're planning out your trip to go to the grocery store, I know a lot of people too are going to have milk on their list with the incoming weather. It's okay to get the stuff that comes from the stores. Pasteurization does kill a number of harmful bacteria and viruses, and that does include bird flu. So as long as you're not drinking raw milk directly from a cow, odds are you're going to be okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Grace. Always good advice to keep us healthy here. Thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. That's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.